Alaska, a territory for the physically and mentally strong. Good evening, friends. Tonight, we venture into the frozen darkness of Alaska, where only the strong survive. These terrifying tales will test your nerves. I'd like to know your location and what time you're watching from. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers and unlock more chilling stories from the last frontier. Welcome to the cold, if you dare. "15 years in emergency medicine teaches you to compartmentalize. You learn to section off the horror, the charred flesh, the compound fractures piercing through skin, the children who don't make it, into neat mental boxes that you can seal shut when your shift ends. You clock out, drive home to your empty apartment in downtown Fairbanks, microwave something that used to be food, and pretend you're a person who doesn't spend their nights elbow deep in other people's trauma. You become very good at being alone. You tell yourself it's a choice. Valentine's Day in the ER is its own special kind of punishment. The couples come in holding hands even when one of them is bleeding, whispering reassurances, being each other's anchors. The single ones come in alone, and you can always tell which accidents happened because someone was distracted by their own loneliness, which overdoses were timed to make a statement nobody would hear. I'd worked the past 8 Valentine's Days straight, volunteering for the shift because what else was I going to do? Sit in my apartment and pretend I didn't notice the couples in the restaurant across the street, their faces warm in candlelight, their hands finding each other across tables? Alaska takes a particular kind of toll on relationships. The darkness. The cold. The geographic isolation that turns Fairbanks into an island of artificial light surrounded by thousands of miles of nothing. My ex-husband had lasted 4 years before accepting a position in Seattle, and he'd asked me to come. Of course he had, but I'd already lost too much to this state to leave it now. My sister Sarah had disappeared here 17 years ago, and leaving felt like abandoning her twice. The call came in at 2:47 a.m. on February 15th, technically no longer Valentine's Day, though the decorations in the ER waiting room hadn't gotten the memo. Red paper hearts and plastic cupids watched with blank eyes as we prepped for the incoming hypothermia case. The dispatcher's voice had been shaking, which was unusual. Fairbanks dispatchers are seasoned, they've heard everything. Adult male, found unresponsive in an open field off Chena Hot Springs Road, she'd said. No coat, no gloves, no cold weather gear. Been exposed for at least 40 minutes based on witness timeline. Ambient temperature -52 Fahrenheit. Wind chill -68. I felt my stomach drop. Those numbers meant death. Not complicated, not maybe, just death. At -52, exposed flesh freezes in less than 5 minutes. After 40 minutes without proper clothing, you're not bringing anyone back. You're just processing a corpse. But protocol is protocol, so we prepared. 4 warmers. Heated blankets. Warm saline. The full resuscitation bay. I'd been the attending on duty, which meant this one was mine. Dr. Rebecca Winters, 41 years old, no family, no Valentine's dates, just me and whatever frozen body they were about to wheel through those doors. When the paramedics crashed through the ambulance bay entrance, I understood why the dispatcher had sounded wrong. The man on the gurney was alive. Not barely alive. Not technically alive. Actually, impossibly alive. His skin was pale but not cyanotic. His lips weren't blue. The cardiac monitor showed a heart rate of 62, slow, but not the profound bradycardia you'd expect from severe hypothermia. The core temperature reading the paramedics had gotten was 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to be dangerous, but nowhere near cold enough for someone who'd been lying in an open field in -52-degree weather for 40 minutes wearing nothing but jeans and a t-shirt. Are you sure about the exposure time? I asked the lead paramedic, a guy named Torres who I'd worked with for years. Good instincts. Didn't panic. Witness saw him walk into the field at 2:05 a.m., Torres said, and his voice had that same wrong quality the dispatchers had. Just walked out into nothing, straight line, then stopped and lay down in the snow. Witness thought maybe suicide attempt, called it in. We got there at 2:45. Walked. I stared at the patient. He walked out there? Witness said he looked calm. Said he was smiling. I looked down at the man's face. He was smiling. A small, peaceful expression that didn't belong on someone we just pulled back from the edge of death. His eyes were closed. He hadn't opened them since they brought him in. We transferred him to a gurney, cut away his clothes. They were stiff with cold but not frozen solid, another impossibility, and started active rewarming. I was checking his pupils with my pen light, noting that they were equal and reactive, when he spoke for the first time. The wallpaper was yellow, he said. His voice was soft, conversational, like we were old friends catching up. His eyes remained closed. The smile didn't change. Sir, can you tell me your name? I asked, switching into assessment mode. Altered mental status. Possible traumatic brain injury. Confusion from hypothermia. With little white flowers, he continued, as if I hadn't spoken. Daisies, I think. Or maybe they were supposed to be stars. Hard to tell with wallpaper patterns. Children's wallpaper always looks a bit like hallucinations anyway. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something in his tone, in the specificity of the detail, felt deliberately pointed. Sir, I need you to. There was a mobile above your bed, he said, and my hands froze. Made of felt, handmade. Ocean creatures. A whale, a dolphin, 2 fish, an octopus. The octopus had one tentacle that was shorter than the others because the stitching came loose and your mother never fixed it. You used to lie there at night and stare at that broken tentacle and wonder if the octopus knew it was incomplete. The penlight clattered from my hands onto the floor. Around me, I could hear the normal sounds of the ER, monitors beeping, distant conversations, someone's radio playing too loud at the nurse's station, but they seemed to come from very far away. My breath was stuck somewhere in my chest. How do you, I started, but my voice came out strangled. No one knew about that mobile. My mother had made it while I was 4 years old, when we lived in that tiny house in Anchorage before we moved to Fairbanks. I hadn't thought about it in decades. I certainly had never told anyone about the broken octopus tentacle, about the strange anxiety that caused my childhood self, the feeling that something in my world was fundamentally wrong and couldn't be fixed. Your mother called you Becca Bird when you had nightmares, he continued, eyes still closed, that placid smile unchanged. Not Rebecca. Not Beck. Becca Bird, because she said you'd flutter your hands when you were scared, like little wings trying to fly away from the bad dreams. I stumbled backward, hitting the crash cart. One of the nurses, Jennifer, I think, though I was having trouble focusing, grabbed my arm to steady me. Dr. Winters? Are you all right? I wasn't all right. Nothing about this was all right. That nickname, that specific, intimate detail that only my mother had used, and only when I was very young, before Sarah disappeared, before everything fell apart. My mother had died 6 years ago in a nursing home in Anchorage, her mind eroded by Alzheimer's until she didn't recognize me anymore. There was no way this stranger could know. Give me his ID, I said to Jennifer, my voice barely steady. Find out who he is. Now. Dr. Winters, your hands are shaking. They were. Trembling like I was the one pulled from the cold. I clenched them into fists. 15 years of emergency medicine, I told myself. 15 years of staying calm under pressure. Compartmentalize. Section it off. Deal with the medical emergency first, unpack the psychological horror later. I forced myself to step back to the bedside. The man's vitals were improving steadily, which was wrong, deeply wrong. Severe hypothermia doesn't resolve this quickly. His core temperature was already up to 92 degrees. His heart rate was strengthening. He looked like someone who'd had a brief chill, not someone who should be dead or dying from catastrophic cold exposure. "Sir," I said, trying to keep my voice professional, clinical. "I need to know how you know those things about me." "The house in Anchorage had a blue door," he said, eyes still closed, and I noticed now that he wasn't even shivering. Hypothermia patients shiver violently as they rewarm. "Number 847, on Carluke Street. You had a dog named Chester, a golden retriever who was terrified of thunder. Your sister Sarah used to hide under the bed with him during storms." Sarah. The name hit me like a physical blow. I staggered, actually staggered, and had to grip the side rail of the gurney to stay upright. Jennifer was saying something, asking if she should page another doctor, but I couldn't process it. All I could hear was the patient's calm voice, still speaking with his eyes closed, describing my sister. "She was 3 years older than you," he said. "She taught you to braid hair using your Barbie dolls. She always wanted to be a veterinarian. She had a birthmark on her left shoulder blade, shaped like a crescent moon. On February 14th, 17 years ago, she went to a party in Fairbanks and never came home." The room tilted. Valentine's Day. Sarah had disappeared on Valentine's Day. She'd been 23, newly graduated from UAF, her whole life stretching ahead like a promise. She'd gone to a party with friends, and then she was just gone. No body. No leads. No closure. Just absence, the kind of hollow space a person leaves behind that never quite fills in. "Who are you?" I whispered. "How do you know these things?" For the first time, his expression changed. The smile faded. Something else moved across his face, something that might have been sadness or might have been something older and less definable. "You should ask different questions," he said quietly. "You should ask where I've been. You should ask what I've seen in the cold places." "What are you talking about?" "Alaska keeps things," he said, and his voice had changed now, taken on a quality that made my skin crawl. "The cold preserves. Did you know that? Bodies in the permafrost, frozen for 10,000 years, still intact. Still complete. Still aware, in their way. The cold doesn't kill everything, Dr. Winters. Sometimes it just holds. Waiting. I should have called security. Should have stepped away, gotten someone else to handle this, someone who wasn't personally implicated in whatever psychological game this was. But I couldn't move. Couldn't look away from his closed eyes, his too calm face, his impossible survival. "I don't understand," I said. "She asked me to tell you something," he said. The world stopped. The monitors, the voices, my heartbeat, everything suspended in that one sentence. "She?" I breathed. "She said to tell you that it was cold at the end." His voice was so gentle now, almost tender. "But that it didn't hurt much. She said the cold feels like warmth after a while. Like being held. She said she stopped being scared after the first few minutes, and then it was just peaceful. Like falling asleep." Tears were running down my face. I didn't remember starting to cry. "You're lying. This is some kind of sick." She was wearing a red coat, he continued, relentless. The one she bought at REI the week before. She thought it made her look like Little Red Riding Hood. She was embarrassed about that, thought it was childish, but she wore it anyway because it was warm. She was always cold, wasn't she? Even in summer, always wearing sweaters, always complaining about the draft. That was true. Sarah had terrible circulation, was always layered up, always seeking warmth. But these were things a person could research, could find out from old news articles or... She's still cold, he said, and his eyes opened. They were blue. Pale blue, like ice, like the color of glacial melt. And they were looking directly at me with an expression of profound, terrible knowing. She's been cold for 17 years, he said. In the ground outside Fairbanks, 6 feet under the permafrost, frozen in that red coat, her hands folded across her chest the way whoever put her there arranged them. She's aware, Dr. Winters. The cold keeps you aware. She's been aware for 17 years, frozen, unable to move, unable to scream, just cold and conscious and alone in the dark. I was making sounds, horrible broken sounds that might have been words or might have been just raw grief forcing its way out. Someone's hands were on my shoulders, Jennifer's, or maybe another nurse's, trying to pull me away, but I was rooted there, staring into those ice blue eyes. That's not possible, I managed. That's not, people don't stay conscious when they... Don't they? He asked. You've never wondered what happens in that window? Between when the heart stops and when the brain finally shuts down? Those minutes, those hours sometimes, when the cells are dying but the consciousness is still firing, still processing, still experiencing? In the warmth, it's fast. But in the cold slows everything down. Preserves everything. Including awareness. Including the self. He sat up. Just sat straight up on the gurney, no weakness, no dizziness, moving with a fluid grace that no hypothermia patient should possess. The monitor shrieked alarms. Staff members scattered backward. But I couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but stare as he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, naked except for the heated blanket draped across his shoulders, his skin impossibly healthy for someone who should still be hypothermic. She wants you to know she forgives you, he said, stepping closer. For not looking hard enough. For moving on with your life. For the years you forgot to visit her grave on her birthday because you were working, because you were trying not to feel it. She understands. The cold teaches understanding. The cold teaches patience. Stay back, I said, but there was no force behind it. She wants you to know she's not alone anymore, he continued. There are others in the cold places. Others who went into the snow and never came back. Others who Alaska keeps. They've built something there, in the frozen ground, in the spaces between death and dying. A kind of community. A kind of home. She's been waiting for you to understand, Becca Bird. All these years, frozen and aware, she's been waiting. He was right in front of me now. I could see that his pupils were wrong, too large, too dark, like they went somewhere deeper than eyes should go. His breath, he was breathing, despite everything, smelled like ice, like the particular scent of Alaskan winter, that sharp cold that burns your lungs. Your sister wants you to know, he said softly, that it's not so bad once you adjust. That the cold becomes a kind of warmth. That being alone becomes a kind of company. That the darkness becomes its own kind of light. He reached out and touched my face with fingers that should have been frostbitten, should have been frozen solid, but were merely cool against my tear-stained cheek. She's waiting for you, he whispered. When your time comes. When Alaska decides to keep you too. She'll be there in the cold place, and you won't be alone anymore. Neither of you will be alone. Then he collapsed. Just dropped like someone had cut his strings, his eyes rolling back, his body hitting the floor with a sound that made everyone in the ER jump. We swarmed him, protocol, training, muscle memory taking over, but even as we worked, even as we got him back on the gurney and stabilized, I knew something fundamental had shifted. His temperature was plummeting, dropping faster than should be possible, like someone had opened a door inside him and let the cold pour in. 90 degrees. 88. 85. We piled heated blankets, pushed warm fluids, did everything right, but his core temperature kept falling like an anchor toward impossible depths. "Dr. Winters, we're losing him," Jennifer shouted. But I was looking at his face, at the smile that had returned, peaceful and strange, and I knew we weren't losing him. We never had him. He'd been lost to the cold long before they'd wheeled him through our doors. He arrested at 3:47 a.m. We called it at 3:52. Official cause of death would eventually be listed as severe hypothermia with cardiac arrest. But I stood there looking at his body, already going waxy and pale, already looking like something preserved rather than something dead, and knew that wasn't the truth. They found his wallet in his pants pocket. No ID. No credit cards. Just a single piece of paper, folded small, with an address written in handwriting I recognized because I'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, had saved birthday cards and school notes that carried that same distinctive script. Sarah's handwriting. The address was a location off Chena Hot Springs Road, coordinates that meant nothing to me but that I knew, with horrible certainty, I would eventually visit. Eventually investigate. Eventually find what Alaska had been keeping in its frozen ground for 17 years. I don't know what happened in the cold place that night. I don't know how a man could walk into negative 52-degree weather and survive long enough to deliver a message from my dead sister. I don't know how he knew things no one could know, saw things no one could see. But I know this, 3 weeks later, I drove out to those coordinates. Found disturbed ground in a field that shouldn't have been disturbed in February, shouldn't have been accessible through the frozen earth. Found a red coat in the snow, ice-crusted and ancient, that matched exactly the one from Sarah's missing person photos. And I know that sometimes, late at night in my apartment, when Fairbanks winter presses against my windows and the temperature drops below negative 40, I can feel something waiting in the cold. Something patient. Something that knows my childhood nickname and remembers yellow wallpaper and understands that loneliness is just another kind of freezing, another way that Alaska keeps you until you can't leave anymore. They never found Sarah's body. But I know she's out there in the permafrost, in the cold places where consciousness doesn't end so much as it transforms into something else, something aware in ways we don't have words for. And I know, with the kind of certainty that lives in your bones, in the animal parts of your brain that remember when death was a thing with teeth, that she's waiting. On Valentine's Day now, I work alone in the ER and try not to think about frozen ground and the kind of preservation that keeps more than just flesh intact. I try not to wonder what it feels like to be aware for 17 years in the dark. I try not to imagine what kind of community gathers in those spaces, what kind of existence waits between the line of death and dying. But every winter, when the temperature drops and stays dropped, when Fairbanks becomes an island of light surrounded by frozen darkness that stretches forever, I feel it pulling. Feel Alaska waiting with the patience of permafrost, ready to preserve, ready to keep, ready to add me to whatever Sarah has become in the cold place. And the horrifying thing, the thing that keeps me awake in my empty apartment on the anniversaries of her disappearance, is that I'm not entirely sure I want to resist anymore. After all, she said she's waiting. She said I wouldn't be alone. And God help me, after 15 years of emergency rooms and empty beds and Valentine's days spent watching other people have what I've lost, the promise of not being alone sounds almost like warmth. Almost like home. Almost like something I could learn to want. I've been running the Dalton Highway for 11 years now. 414 miles of frozen asphalt that cuts through the kind of emptiness most Americans will never understand, the kind that gets inside your chest and makes a home there, carving out pieces of you mile by mile until you're not sure what's highway and what's you anymore. February is the worst month. Not just because of the cold that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth, or the darkness that swallows everything north of Fairbanks for 20 hours a day. February is the worst because it forces you to acknowledge exactly how alone you are. Valentine's Day had come and gone without ceremony. I passed through Coldfoot around noon, population maybe 10 in winter, if you're generous, and seen the handful of pipeline workers drinking in the one bar that stays open, their laughter spilling out into air cold enough to shatter. Someone had taped paper hearts to the frost-covered windows, a pathetic gesture toward normalcy in a place where normal died a long time ago. My ex-wife Linda was probably somewhere warm, somewhere with actual people, celebrating with someone who remembered to come home more than twice a month. Someone who didn't smell like diesel fuel and road salt. Someone whose hands didn't shake from too much coffee and too little sleep. The irony wasn't lost on me, spending the day of love alone in a Peterbilt, hauling drilling equipment to Deadhorse, talking to nobody but myself and the occasional garbled voice on the CB radio. The highway stretched ahead like a scar across the permafrost, my headlights barely denting the oppressive black. This far north in February, the sun makes a brief, apologetic appearance around 11 a.m., then surrenders to the darkness like it knows it doesn't belong here. It was somewhere between the Yukon River crossing and Coldfoot, around 3 in the morning, when my CB crackled to life. The sound made me jolt, not because it was unexpected, but because it was wrong. The frequency was one I'd never heard active, a channel truckers don't use because it's reserved for emergency services. The voice that came through was male, measured, and possessed of a calmness that immediately set my teeth on edge. People in real distress don't sound like that. They don't enunciate every word with the precision of someone reading a prepared statement. North 66.9741, West 150.3385, the voice said. Do not stop. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not look to the sides. Then silence. Not even static. Just dead air that felt heavier than it should. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white in the dashboard glow. Protocol dictated I respond to any distress call on this route, Alaska state law, in fact. The Dalton isn't like other highways. There are stretches where you won't see another vehicle for days. If someone breaks down out here, if someone needs help, you stop. You have to stop. It's an unspoken covenant among those of us who make this run. We're all that stands between each other and the kind of death that takes its time. I grabbed my GPS unit, punched in the coordinates. Quarter mile ahead, east side of the highway. My heart was doing something unpleasant in my chest, a stuttering rhythm that reminded me I'd been awake for 19 hours and my last meal had been a gas station sandwich in Fairbanks that tasted like regret and preservatives. The rational part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive through 11 Alaskan winters, through whiteouts and black ice and mechanical failures in places where help was theoretical at best, was screaming that something was profoundly wrong. But the human part, the part that still remembered what it meant to be responsible for another person's survival, made me slow down. The tracks appeared in my headlight beams like a wound opening in the snow. Fresh tire marks, wide enough to be from a commercial vehicle, veering sharply off the road and disappearing into the spruce forest that pressed against the highway like a wall of shadows. No skid marks. No signs of loss of control. Just a deliberate turn into nothing. I brought the Peterbilt to a stop, engine idling with a rumble I could feel in my bones. My breath was fogging the windshield despite the heater running full blast. Outside temperature reading, -42 Fahrenheit. Cold enough that exposed skin freezes in minutes. Cold enough that your lungs burn with each breath. I should have called it in. Should have radioed the nearest DOT station and let them handle it. But the coordinates had been specific. Someone had given those coordinates knowing I would come. knowing someone would come. The fear that crawled up my spine then wasn't the clean fear of physical danger. It was something older, more primitive, the kind of dread our ancestors felt looking into dark caves, knowing something might be looking back. I grabbed my flashlight, my satellite phone, and against every survival instinct I possessed, I opened the door. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. The beam of my flashlight cut through darkness that seemed to resist illumination, revealing the tire tracks in sharp detail. They were recent, within the last hour, I estimate. Snow this dry and powdery drifts fast, fills in tracks like the landscape trying to erase evidence of human presence. I'd followed them. The forest here is nothing like the woods in the lower 48. These are trees that have survived in conditions that kill everything soft, everything weak. Black spruce, stunted and twisted, their branches heavy with snow and something that felt like malice. The silence was absolute. No wind. No animal sounds. Just my boots crunching through snow and the ragged sawing of my own breathing. 40 meters in, the tracks stopped. Not gradually. Not at a clearing or an obstruction. They simply ended, mid-trail, as if the vehicle had been lifted straight up into the air. I swept my flashlight in wide arcs, searching for any sign of where it might have gone. No disturbed snow. No gouges in the earth. No crashed vehicle wrapped around a tree trunk. Nothing. The beam of my flashlight was shaking. I only realized it was my hand trembling when I tried to steady it against my thigh. The temperature out here was already working its way through my insulated coveralls, that peculiar Alaskan cold that finds every gap in your clothing and settles in your joints like broken glass. That's when I looked down and saw the second set of footprints. They ran parallel to mine. Perfect parallel. Same depth in the snow, same spacing, same tread pattern. My boots. My gait. But going in the opposite direction, back toward the highway. The horror of it hit me in stages. First, the impossibility. I had walked in a straight line, following the tire tracks. These prints ran alongside mine, perhaps 5 feet to my left, matching my path exactly. Second, the implications. Someone or something had walked beside me the entire time, keeping pace, staying just outside my peripheral vision in the darkness. I spun around, flashlight cutting wild patterns through the trees, my free hand fumbling for the canister of bear spray on my belt. The forest gave back nothing. No movement. No sound. Just those prints in the snow, running parallel to mine, ending where I now stood. My mind was racing through explanations, each one more inadequate than the last. Optical illusion. Snow drift patterns. Exhaustion playing tricks. But the prints were there, undeniable in their specificity, and they were fresh, made in the last few minutes, while I had been walking this exact path. The walk back to my truck was the longest 40 meters of my life. I kept my flashlight pointed behind me, walking backward, watching those twin trails in the snow. My own prints heading in. The other prints heading out. Perfect mirrors. Perfect companions. Something my grandfather told me once, back when I was a kid in Anchorage, before I knew what this state could do to a person. Alaska doesn't have ghosts like other places. It has absences. Places where people should be but aren't. Spaces where the world forgot to fill something in. He'd been a trapper, spent months alone in the interior, and he'd said it with the kind of certainty that comes from experience, not superstition. I was almost back to the highway when I heard it. My own voice. Coming from somewhere in the trees to my left, it was calling out coordinates. The same coordinates from the radio transmission, but in my voice, with my inflection, with the same slight rasp I get after too many cigarettes and too much coffee. North 66.9741, West 150.3385. Do not stop. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not look to the sides. I ran. Survival instinct overriding everything else, I crashed through the snow toward the faint glow of my truck's running lights on the highway. Behind me, my voice continued its calm recitation, now joined by others, other voices, other warnings, other coordinates, all layered over each other in a cacophony of distress calls that had never reached their destinations. I slammed the truck door hard enough to make the whole cab shake, locked it with fingers that barely functioned, and sat there gasping like I'd surfaced from deep water. The voices cut off the moment the door closed. The silence that replaced them was somehow worse. My CB radio crackled. Did you find it? The same male voice from before, still unnervingly calm. I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. Find what? There's nothing out there. No vehicle, no. Did you find what you're looking for? The voice interrupted. What you've been looking for every night on this highway for 11 years? My blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Who is this? I demanded. You know who this is, the voice said, and there was something familiar in its cadence now, something I was desperately trying not to recognize. You've been alone so long, you've forgotten what company feels like. Even your own. I stared at the CB unit like it might grow teeth. The tire tracks, the voice continued, conversational now, almost friendly. Did you notice they were the same width as your Peterbilt? The same tread pattern? The same weight distribution? I hadn't. But now that it said it, I could see them in my memory, identical to the tracks my own truck left in the snow every day. And the footprints, my voice said from the radio, because it was my voice now, unmistakably mine. Did you wonder why they knew exactly where you would step? Why they matched your strides so perfectly? The temperature in the cab seemed to drop despite the heater. I could see my breath now, small clouds of condensation that shouldn't exist in an enclosed, heated space. 11 years, the voice, my voice, said softly. 11 years of driving this route, alone, talking to yourself, becoming less and less certain where the highway ends and you begin. Did you really think you were still the only one in this truck? I looked at the passenger seat. Empty, as it had been for thousands of miles. But the seatbelt was buckled. I never buckle a passenger seatbelt. Never. Valentine's Day, my voice said from the radio, and there was something like pity in it now. Everyone else has someone. Everyone else has a second heartbeat in their life. You have one too. You've had one for a long time. You just haven't been listening. I sat perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly. In the side mirror, I could see the tracks I'd left in the snow walking back from the forest. One set of footprints. Just one. The prints leading into the forest, the ones I'd followed, I hadn't looked at them carefully. I'd assumed they were mine because I was following them. But they couldn't have been. I'd walked in a straight line from my truck to where the tire tracks ended. Which meant the prints I'd been following were already there. Waiting for me. Leading me exactly where I would go, made by someone who knew my every step before I took it. The radio hissed static, then, keep driving. Dead horses still 200 miles north. We have so much time together. We've always had all the time in the world. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel and noticed for the first time that my right hand, my dominant hand, the one I use for everything, had a smudge of something dark on the palm. I brought it closer to my face. Oil, maybe. Or old blood. It formed a pattern, crude but deliberate, a heart shape, like a child might draw. Like someone might tape to a window in Coldfoot. Like someone might trace on a frosted windshield while you weren't looking. The Peterbilt's engine rumbled steadily, waiting for me to make a choice. North to Dead Horse. South to Fairbanks. Or stay here, in this spot where the coordinates had led me, where tire tracks appeared from nowhere and footprints walked beside you in the dark. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the Dalton Highway, heading north because that's what the schedule said, because that's what I always did, because stopping would mean acknowledging what I already knew in the part of my mind that had been screaming since I saw those parallel prints in the snow. In the rearview mirror, I watched my own eyes watching back, and I couldn't be entirely certain which one of us was driving anymore. The highway stretched ahead into darkness that would last another 16 hours, and somewhere in that darkness, my voice on the CB was giving out new coordinates, new warnings, calling out to the next driver who would be alone enough, isolated enough, desperate enough to answer. The heart on my palm was still there when I glanced down again. Still wet. Still warm. And in the passenger seat, the buckled seatbelt shifted slightly, adjusting to weight that had been there all along, weight I'd been carrying mile after mile, year after year, the only companion that would never leave, never complain about the smell of diesel and loneliness, never ask me to be anything other than what I'd become. Outside, Alaska swallowed my headlights whole, and I drove on into the dark, no longer certain whether I was fleeing something or bringing it with me, no longer sure if the voice on the radio was calling for help or offering it, no longer able to distinguish between the solitude I'd chosen and the presence I'd created to fill it. The GPS showed 203 miles to Dead Horse. The CB crackled once more, and this time I recognized the voice immediately. It was mine from 3 years ago, younger, not quite as worn down, still holding on to hope that this isolation was temporary. It was reading off coordinates again, and when I checked my current position, I felt something in my chest go very cold and very still. The coordinates were exactly where I was. Right now. This moment. Do not stop, my younger voice said. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not look to the sides. But I was already looking. In the side mirror, I could see footprints appearing in the snow beside my moving truck, keeping perfect pace, the same boots, the same stride, walking alongside me in the darkness, and they'd been there all along, following me home every night, waiting patiently in the passenger seat for me to finally turn and acknowledge what 11 years of solitude on the Dalton Highway had made necessary, what Valentine's Day in the emptiest place in America had made inevitable. I wasn't alone. I'd never been alone. And that was so much worse. I've guided 32 expeditions on Denali. 32 times I've helped people summit North America's highest peak, watched them cry on the mountaintop, held their hands when altitude sickness made them vomit blood, dragged them down when they couldn't walk anymore. I've lost 3 clients to the mountain, falls, cerebral edema, a sudden storm that came out of nowhere and took a man before we could get his oxygen mask on. You'd think that would be enough to make me quit. But the truth is simpler and more pathetic. The mountain is the only place I don't feel alone. Valentine's Day had come and gone while I was establishing base camp at 7,000 feet. I'd watched it happen from Talkeetna, sitting in the roadhouse eating a burger by myself while couples shared desserts and held hands across tables sticky with syrup. My ex-wife Jennifer was probably in Portland with her new husband, the accountant, the guy with regular hours who didn't spend 7 months a year on a mountain. She tried to make it work, really tried, but there's only so many Valentine's Days you can spend alone before you stop believing your partner is coming back down. The solo verification climb was supposed to be routine. February was off-season, no clients, just me checking routes and fixed lines before the spring climbing season started. The National Park Service paid me for it, but mainly I volunteered because where else was I going to go? Back to my studio apartment in Anchorage? Back to the silence that felt different from mountain silence, heavier somehow, more accusatory? At least on Denali, the loneliness felt purer. Earned. The kind of solitude that came with purpose. I'd been climbing for 3 days, working my way up the West Buttress route, when I first saw the tent. It was at 14,200 feet, at the edge of the basin where we usually establish Camp 3. The altitude was already doing its work on me, that persistent headache behind the eyes, the way thoughts took a second longer to form, the constant awareness of my own breathing. I'd been doing this long enough that I could push through it, could function at heights that would incapacitate most people, but it never got easy. The air up here was thin enough that reality felt thin too, like you were existing in a space where the normal rules didn't quite apply. The tent shouldn't have been there. I knew every permitted expedition on the mountain, there were none. Winter climbing on Denali was rare, and February climbs were almost unheard of. The weather was too unpredictable, the cold too extreme, the darkness too pervasive. And yet, there it was, an orange tent, dome-style, staked into the ice about 200 meters from where I planned to set my own camp. The orange was wrong. Not modern orange, not the bright synthetic color of contemporary climbing gear. This was a faded, sun-bleached orange that spoke of age, of years spent at ultraviolet exposure at altitude. The tent's design was wrong too, older, with a profile I recognized from mountaineering history books. A North Face model from the 70s, maybe early 80s, before modern materials and engineering transformed high-altitude camping. I stood there for a long time, just staring. The wind was screaming, it always screamed at this elevation, and the cold was the kind that found every microscopic gap in your layering system and settled in your bones. My altimeter watch showed 14,194 feet. My GPS confirmed the coordinates. Everything was normal except for this impossible tent that absolutely should not exist. Protocol said I should radio down to base camp, report the anomaly, wait for instructions. But the thing about spending too much time alone on mountains is that you start to trust your own judgment more than you trust human voices crackling through static. And my judgment said, someone might be in trouble. I approached slowly, fighting the altitude and the wind. This close, I could see the tent was intact, no tears, no damage from the elements, no signs of being half buried by the constant accumulation of snow that should have covered anything left here for more than a few days. It looked almost maintained. Almost deliberately preserved. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by wind almost before it left my mouth. "Anyone in there?" "This is Jake Morrison. I'm a guy with alpine ascents." "Are you okay?" No response. Just wind and the peculiar silence that exists above 14,000 feet, where the air is too thin to carry sound properly. I got closer. Through the tent's nylon wall, translucent with age and wear, I could see a shape inside. A person. Sitting. Not moving. Every instinct I'd developed over 15 years of mountain rescue was screaming. This was wrong. This was fundamentally, cosmically wrong. But I'd also seen what altitude could do to people, how cerebral edema could make you sit down and never get up, how hypothermia made you feel warm at the end so you took off your clothes and died smiling. If someone was in distress, if there was even a chance I could help. "I'm coming in," I announced, reaching for the tent zipper. The sound it made was wrong, not the smooth glide of modern zippers but an older, stiffer mechanism that caught and stuttered. Inside, the smell hit me first, not the expected stench of human habitation, not the funk of bodies and waste that accumulated in high-altitude camps, but something else. Something like cold storage. Like a freezer that had been sealed for decades. The figure was there, sitting exactly as I'd seen through the tent wall. A man, dressed in climbing gear that confirmed my initial assessment, equipment from the 70s. An old-style down jacket, faded red. Plastic mountaineering boots that predated modern designs by decades. A wool balaclava covering most of his face. He was sitting cross-legged, hands resting on his knees, facing the tent entrance as if he'd been waiting. As if he'd been waiting for me specifically. "Sir?" My voice sounded strange in the enclosed space, muffled and too loud at the same time. "Are you all right?" He didn't move. Didn't respond. I reached out with one gloved hand, touched his shoulder, and felt through the layers the unmistakable rigidity of frozen flesh. Dead, then. Dead for a long time, preserved by the cold the way Denali preserved everything, keeping bodies intact for decades, keeping them recognizable long after they should have decomposed into nothing. I should have backed out. Should have radioed this in immediately. But something made me look closer, made me notice the details that my altitudinal brain was struggling to process. His position. Perfectly upright, perfectly balanced, as if he'd arranged himself deliberately before dying. His hands, folded just so on his knees. His face, or what I could see of it beneath the balaclava, turned directly toward the tent entrance at exactly the angle where someone entering would make immediate eye contact. And the tent itself, no sleeping bag, no stove, no supplies. Just this body, sitting in this position, in this tent that shouldn't be here. That's why I saw the camera. It was hanging around his neck, an old Nikon, the kind that used actual film, heavy and mechanical and completely outdated. And it was pointing at me. No, not at me. At the entrance. At exactly where someone would be when they first came through that zipper. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was just the altitude, just the cold, just the natural response to finding a corpse in an impossible location. But it wasn't. It was the wrongness, the deliberate arrangement, the growing certainty that I was inside something that had been set up with meticulous care and purpose. I reached for the camera with fingers made clumsy by thick gloves and altitude and fear. The strap was frozen, stiff with age, but it came away from the body with a sound like breaking ice. The camera was impossibly well preserved, no corrosion, no weather damage, as if it had been sealed away from the elements despite hanging on a corpse in a tent at 14,000 feet. There was film inside. I could tell from the weight, from the tension in the advanced mechanism. Exposed film. Pictures that had been taken and never developed. I should have left it. Should have documented the scene and gotten the hell off this mountain. But I'd been alone too long, had spent too many hours in my own head with nothing but wind and ice for company, and the human brain does strange things when it's starved for oxygen and human connection. It makes you curious. It makes you stupid. I backed out of the tent, camera in hand, and the moment I emerged into the screaming wind, I saw the other tent. My tent. The one I'd set up 200 meters away before I'd noticed the orange one. Except now I could see it from this angle, see it in a way I hadn't been able to before, and something about its position relative to the basin's geography was terribly, impossibly familiar. I'd seen this exact view before. In a photograph. In a famous photograph from a 1973 expedition that had ended in tragedy when 2 climbers disappeared without a trace on Denali's upper slopes. No. That wasn't possible. That was altitude sickness, hypoxia making me draw connections that didn't exist, making me paranoid and confused. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally, to remember my training about how thin air could make you hallucinate, could make you believe impossible things. But I was still holding the camera. And cameras don't hallucinate. I made it back to my tent in a stumbling half-run, my breathing ragged, my heart doing dangerous things at this altitude. Inside, I sealed the entrance and sat there in the small space, the camera in my lap, trying to decide what to do next. The rational choice was obvious: radio down, report the body, let someone else figure out the mystery. But I'd spent 15 years watching people make decisions on this mountain, had developed a sixth sense for when something was normal dangerous versus when something was wrong in a way that transcended normal categories of risk. This was the second kind. I had a compact film scanner in my gear, a modern convenience for documenting route conditions. With hands that wouldn't stop shaking, I opened the camera's back, extracted the film canister, and loaded it into the scanner connected to my satellite phone. The first image made me drop the phone. It was me. or someone who looked exactly like me. Sitting in a tent, my tent, I recognized the specific pattern of wear on my sleeping bag, eating from an emery pouch. The photo was dated, printed in the corner in faded orange numbers, February 14th, 1973. Valentine's Day. 53 years ago. I scrolled to the next image. Same tent. Same person. Lying down now, sleeping, face partially visible. My face. My scar on the left eyebrow from a childhood fall. My distinctive crooked nose from a climbing accident in my 20s. The next photo showed the same person, showed me, leaving the tent, walking toward where the orange tent would be. The timestamp read February 14th, 1973, 14:47. I looked at my watch. 14:39, February 14th, 2026. 8 minutes from now, if the timeline held, if this insanity held, I would be walking toward that tent. Already had walked toward that tent. Was always going to walk toward that tent. The horror of it crashed over me in waves. This wasn't a mystery to solve. This was a loop. A trap. Something that had been waiting here for 53 years, and I had been the bait, the victim, and the architect all at once. The next photos were worse. They showed me opening the tent, finding the body, taking the camera. The angles were impossible, shot from outside the tent, from positions where no one could have been standing. The last photo showed me sitting in my tent, looking down at a phone, face frozen in an expression of dawning horror. It showed this exact moment. I dropped the phone like it was burning. The photo on the screen stared back at me, captured from an angle that would require someone to be floating in the air outside my tent, looking down through the nylon at me sitting here, seeing what I was seeing, knowing what I was realizing. My radio crackled. I hadn't turned it on. Hadn't touched it since I'd set up camp. Jake? A voice. Male. Familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. You're running out of time, buddy. Who is this? I grabbed the radio, pressed the transmit button with fumbling fingers. How did you? You need to understand something about Denali, the voice continued, ignoring my question. It's not just a mountain. It's a place where time doesn't work right. Too high. Too cold. Too isolated. Things get stuck here. Moments get stuck here. You've been alone too long, Jake. The mountain noticed. This isn't real, I said, my voice cracking. This is altitude sickness. This is. Is it? Look outside your tent. To the north. What do you see? I didn't want to look. Every cell in my body was screaming not to look. But I looked anyway, because that's what humans do. We look at the thing we're afraid of. We confirm our horror. Through the tent's mesh window, I could see another orange tent. Farther up the mountain, at maybe 15,000 feet. And beyond that, higher still, another one. And another. A trail of orange tents climbing toward the summit, each one separated by about 800 feet, like markers on a path that led somewhere I couldn't comprehend. February 14th, 1973, the voice on the radio said. That's when you first got stuck. When the loop started. You've been climbing this mountain for 53 years, Jake. Over and over. Setting up the tent. Finding the body. Taking the camera. Seeing the photos. Every year, same day, same time. Happy Valentine's Day. No, I whispered. No, I'm 43 years old. I have memories. I have a life. I had a wife, I had. You had those things once, the voice agreed. In 1973, You were a young guide. 24 years old. It was your first solo verification climb. You were thinking about your girlfriend back in Anchorage, how you were going to propose when you got back, how you were tired of being alone on mountains while everyone else got to be in love. And then you found the orange tent. And then you found yourself in the orange tent. And then the mountain decided to keep you. I was hyperventilating now, sucking down the thin air too fast, making myself dizzy. The dates. The equipment in that tent had been from the 70s because it was from the 70s. The body was wearing my gear, my original gear, from before modern materials, before technological advancement, before I'd supposedly lived decades that now felt like false memories implanted by a mountain that was doing something impossible to time itself. The other tents, I managed to say. The ones going up. Every year you climb a little higher, the voice said, and now I recognized it. It was my voice. Older. Tired. Speaking from one of those other tents, one of the iterations of me that had already made it farther up this impossible chain. The mountain lets you climb. Every February 14th, you wake up at 7,000 feet, you start the verification climb, you find your previous year's body, you take the camera, you see the proof, and then you climb higher. Leaving yourself behind for next year's you to find. And the you from next year will leave himself for the year after. Forever. That's what the mountain does to people who are alone too long. It gives you company. Your own company. Forever. I looked at the photos again. Looked at my face frozen in horror, captured by a camera operated by no human hand. The mountain itself was the photographer. The mountain itself was the curator of this loop, keeping me in perfect preservation, letting me experience the same realization year after year after year. It doesn't hurt, the voice, my voice, continued. After a while, you stop fighting it. You start to understand that loneliness was the real problem all along. Up here, you're never really alone. You have all your other selves, scattered up the mountain, each one a year older, each one understanding a little more. We're always with you, Jake. We're always waiting. I crawled to the tent entrance, zipped it open, and looked up at the trail of orange tents climbing toward the summit. How many were there? How many years had I been climbing? How many versions of me were sitting in those tents, waiting for their moment to speak through the radio, to guide the newest iteration through the revelation? The wind had died down. In the sudden silence, I could hear other sounds. Voices, distant but clear, calling down from the upper camps. All my voice. All me. All saying the same thing in slight variations. Keep climbing. We're waiting. You're not alone anymore. Happy Valentine's Day. I looked at my watch. 14:47, the exact time from the photograph. The moment when I would start walking toward the orange tent, completing the loop, becoming the body that next year's me would find. But I was already that body. Had always been that body. Would always be that body. The thing about Denali is that it's not just tall. It's isolated. Standing alone in the Alaska range, no other peaks nearby to diminish its dominance, no other mountains to share its relationship with the sky. It knows what it's like to be singular. Solitary. Separated from everything else by sheer altitude and cold. Maybe that's why it understood. Why it decided to help. Why it took a guide who was tired of being alone on Valentine's Day and gave him the one thing he needed, permanent company with the only person who would never leave. I stood up. The altitude didn't bother me anymore. The cold felt almost warm. I looked up at the trail of orange tents and started walking, not toward my camp, but toward the next position. 15,000 feet. Where I would set up another tent, where I would sit and wait for next year, where I would become one more voice on the radio guiding the next iteration through his revelation. Behind me, in my tent, the camera would wait. In my sleeping position, photographed from impossible angles, I would wait. The loop would continue, perfect and unbroken, a valentine written in time and ice and infinite repetition. The mountain had given me what I'd always wanted, to never be alone again. And the truly disturbing thing, the thing that made perfect, horrifying sense as I climbed toward my future self, was that I was grateful. After all, everyone else had someone to spend Valentine's Day with. Now I had infinite someones. All of them were me. And we would climb together forever, company in our own loneliness, partners in our own isolation, never separate, never apart, never able to leave this mountain that had finally understood what we needed and given it to us in the cruelest possible way. The summit was still so far above. I wondered how many years it would take to reach it. I wondered what waited there, what final revelation existed at the top of this impossible loop. I wondered if I would ever want to know. I'd spent 3 Valentine's Days alone before I finally stopped counting. The 4th was when I accepted the volunteer position with Arctic Communities Initiative, documenting the displacement of coastal Alaskan villages being swallowed by erosion and rising seas. My friends in Seattle thought I was being noble, sacrificing my comfort to help indigenous communities preserve their stories before their land disappeared into the Bering Sea. The truth was simpler and more pathetic. I was running away from coffee shops full of couples, from my empty apartment where my ex-boyfriend's ghost still occupied half the closet space, from the specific kind of loneliness that comes from living in a city of millions and still eating dinner alone every single night. Newtok seemed like the perfect escape. A Yupik village of maybe 300 people, accessible only by boat or plane, so remote that cell service was a fantasy, and the nearest town with a traffic light was Bethel, 90 miles away. The kind of place where loneliness would feel different, earned somehow, a consequence of geography rather than personal failure. Where spending Valentine's Day alone wouldn't feel like a choice I'd made through accumulated small failures of connection, but rather an inevitable result of being somewhere the holiday couldn't reach. I arrived in early February, flown in on a bush plane that landed on a strip of frozen ground that barely deserved to be called a runway. The village was exactly what the briefing materials had described: wooden houses on stilts to protect against flooding, a school, a clinic, a tiny store, and everywhere the visceral evidence of a community being consumed by the earth itself. Buildings tilting at angles that defied stability. Streets cracking and subsiding. The permafrost underneath melting, turning solid ground into something fluid and treacherous, making the whole village feel temporary, like it might slide into the Ninglick River at any moment. The project coordinator, a tired woman named Margaret from Anchorage, showed me to my housing, a small room in the community center with a space heater that rattled and a window that looked east toward the eroding riverbank. She gave me my equipment: cameras, audio recorders, external hard drives, a satellite uplink for sending data back to the organization servers in Fairbanks. "Document everything," she said. "The house is being abandoned. The family's packing. The elders talking about what they're losing. We need a complete record before the relocation happens. Some of these families have been here for generations. Some of them don't want to leave even though the village is literally falling into the river." I spent the first week doing exactly that. Taking thousands of photos, recording dozens of interviews, filling up hard drives with the mundane and heartbreaking details of a community preparing to disappear. An elder showing me where his grandfather's house used to stand, now 100 yards into the river, claimed by erosion. A young mother packing her children's toys, crying because the new village wouldn't have the same view of the tundra where she'd learned to hunt with her father. A teenager showing me photos on his phone of places that no longer existed, scroll shopping through deleted geography. Valentine's Day came and went without ceremony. Someone in the village store had put up a construction paper heart, but it felt token, performative, like they'd learned they were supposed to acknowledge the day but weren't entirely sure why. I spent it photographing the eastern edge of the village, where the most dramatic erosion was occurring, where you could stand at the edge and look down at the river carving away the land at a rate that was almost visible if you watched long enough. That evening, an elder named Agnes found me in the community center, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop. She was old in a way that transcended numbers, that specifically Alaskan kind of old that came from surviving conditions that wore down softer people. Her face was mapped with wrinkles that spoke of decades squinting into wind and snow. Her hands were gnarled from a lifetime of work that my generation of Americans couldn't comprehend. She stood in my doorway for a long time, just watching me work. When she finally spoke, her English was precise and deliberate, each word chosen with care. "You should not photograph the east side of the village after dark," she said. I looked up from my laptop. "I'm sorry?" "The east side, where the land meets the river. Do not take photographs there once the sun is down." Her eyes were steady on mine, no humor, no uncertainty. "Can I ask why?" I said, trying to sound respectful. I'd been briefed on cultural sensitivity, on the importance of honoring traditional beliefs even when they didn't align with my urban, secular worldview. Agnes was quiet for a long moment. "Some things that are leaving don't want to be forgotten," she finally said. "Some things that are being erased want to be remembered. When you take pictures, you're making memory permanent. Sometimes that calls attention." It was cryptic in the way that I'd learned elder warnings often were, half metaphor, half genuine belief, all impossible to parse with my outsider's framework. I nodded, made appropriately respectful noises, and assumed she was talking about spirits or traditional beliefs about photography stealing souls, the kind of thing anthropologists wrote papers about. I should have listened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind was screaming, it always screamed in Newtok, a constant assault that made the walls of the community center shudder and groan. My space heater cycled on and off with mechanical wheezes that sounded almost organic, almost like breathing. And I kept thinking about Agnes's warning, about the east side of the village, about how I'd been explicitly told not to do something which of course made me want to do it more. The thing about being alone too long is that you start to make bad decisions. Not because you're stupid, but because the normal social feedback loops that regulate human behavior stop functioning. There's no one to say that's a terrible idea or maybe sleep on it first, or are you sure? There's just you and your thoughts, and thoughts alone can justify anything. Around midnight, I grabbed my camera and headed east. The village was dead silent except for the wind. No lights in windows. No movement. Just the dark shapes of houses on stilts, looking like they were trying to walk away from the encroaching river on their wooden legs. The temperature was somewhere around 5 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that my breath crystallized instantly, cold enough that the inside of my nose froze with each inhalation. The eastern edge of the village was marked by a no-man's land of abandoned structures, houses that had been evacuated because the ground beneath them was no longer trustworthy, buildings that tilted at angles that made your inner ear scream wrongness. Beyond that was the drop-off where the land simply ended, carved away by the river's patient hunger. I took photographs. Lots of them. Long exposures to capture the darkness, the silhouettes of dying structures, the vast emptiness of the Alaskan night. Through the viewfinder, it all looked dramatic and artistic, the kind of images that would accompany long-form journalism pieces about climate change and indigenous displacement. The kind of photos that would make people in Seattle feel appropriately sad for 5 minutes before scrolling to something else. I didn't notice anything wrong while I was shooting. The viewfinder showed exactly what I expected: darkness, structures, emptiness. It was only later, back in my room, that I saw it. In the first photo, a wide shot of the abandoned houses, there was something in the background. A figure, standing at what I estimated was maybe 200 yards away, at the very edge where the tundra disappeared into darkness. Tall. Indistinct. Just barely visible in the shadows, like someone standing very still, watching. I hadn't seen anyone out there. The village had been empty. I would have noticed a person standing in the freezing darkness. I clicked to the next photo. Same composition, taken maybe 30 seconds later. The figure was still there. Same position. Same distance. Same patient stillness. Third photo. Fourth. Fifth. Each one showed the figure, always at the same distance, always in the background, always watching. Then the sixth photo. The figure was closer. Not a lot closer, but enough to be noticeable. Maybe 180 yards now instead of 200. Still indistinct, still just a dark shape against darker shadows, but definitely, unmistakably nearer. My hands started shaking. I clicked through the remaining photos faster. With each image, the figure was closer. Not moving between shots, it didn't appear in intermediate positions. It was just there, at progressively shorter distances, like it was being pulled toward the camera by some invisible force. Or like the space between it and me was collapsing in stages, eating up the distance between observer and observed. By the last photo I'd taken, the figure was maybe 50 yards away. Close enough that I should have been able to see details, should have been able to identify who or what it was. But the darkness that obscured it seemed deliberate, seemed to cling to it in a way that darkness doesn't naturally behave. Through the camera's lens, it looked like someone had taken an eraser to that specific part of the image, removing definition while leaving the shape intact. I sat there for a long time, staring at my laptop screen, trying to find rational explanations. Camera malfunction. Lens flare. Pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns and faces in random data. Compression artifacts in the digital files. Anything other than the obvious, impossible explanation that something had been out there with me, getting closer with each photograph, and I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The thing is, I wanted to believe it was a technical glitch. I wanted to be the rational person, the documentarian with her master's degree in visual anthropology from the University of Washington, the skeptic who understood that supernatural explanations were just gaps in scientific understanding. But I'd taken these photos myself. I'd been there. And I knew with the kind of certainty that lives in your hindbrain, in the parts of you that evolved to recognize predators in the dark, that what I was seeing was real. I didn't sleep. Just sat there cycling through the photos, zooming in on the figure, trying to extract detail from shadows that refused to yield information. As the night wore on and my exhaustion deepened, the figure almost seemed to have features, suggestions of a face, hints of clothing, the ghost of an expression that might have been anticipation or hunger or something that had no human name. Agnes was waiting for me at breakfast. She took one look at my face and knew. "You photographed the east side," she said. Not a question. I nodded, too tired to pretend otherwise. "Show me." We went back to my room. I pulled up the photos on my laptop, watching Agnes's face as she looked at each one, seeing the figure progress closer and closer. Her expression didn't change. No surprise. No fear. Just a tired kind of resignation, like she was looking at the inevitable conclusion to a story she'd heard too many times. "She's noticed you now," Agnes said quietly. "Once they see you seeing them, they don't stop. They follow." "They?" My voice sounded hollow. "The ones that are being erased. The places, the people, the memories, when land disappears into the river, when houses fall into the water, when graves wash away, where do you think they go? The things that were there?" I wanted to say that houses were just materials, that graves were just earth and bone, that when things were destroyed they simply ceased to exist. But I'd been in Newtok long enough to understand that this village was more than structures and geography. It was accumulated meaning, generations of connection to specific pieces of ground, spiritual significance that couldn't be measured in acres or elevation. "What do I do?" I asked. Agnes looked at me for a long moment. "You leave. Before dawn tomorrow. You take your pictures and your recordings and you leave." Maybe that's enough. Maybe she just wanted to be documented, wanted someone to record that she was here before the river takes the rest. Maybe that satisfies her. Maybe? Maybe not, Agnes said. Maybe she's been alone too long, erased too much, forgotten too thoroughly. Maybe she doesn't want to be left behind again. Maybe she sees in you someone else who's alone, who knows what it feels like to be displaced, to lose your home, to watch pieces of yourself wash away. The accuracy of that observation hit me like a physical blow. That's exactly what I was, displaced, disconnected, watching pieces of my life in Seattle wash away through bad relationships and failed connections until I had nothing left but the desire to be somewhere else, anywhere else. "You need to leave before dawn," Agnes repeated. "Promise me." I promised. The day crawled past with surreal slowness. I tried to work, tried to review other photos and conduct interviews, but I kept coming back to those images. Kept zooming in on that figure, kept trying to understand what I was looking at. In the harsh light of afternoon, it seemed almost silly, just shadows, just artifacts, just my imagination working overtime in an isolated place where everyone believed in things I'd been taught to dismiss. But then evening came. The light died. The wind picked up. And I found myself standing at the window of my room, looking east toward the river, toward the eroding edge where I'd stood last night taking photographs. And I saw her. Not in a photo. Not through a lens. Standing out there in the blue twilight, maybe 100 yards away, exactly where she'd been in one of the middle photographs. A dark figure against darker landscape, not moving, just standing. Watching my window. Watching me. I stumbled backward, knocking over my desk chair. When I looked again, she was gone. But the space where she'd been felt wrong somehow, like the air there was denser, like her absence was more substantial than her presence. I started packing immediately. Threw everything into my bags with shaking hands, cameras, hard drives, clothes, equipment. I'd promised Agnes I'd leave before dawn, but that was hours away, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave now, immediately, to put distance between myself and whatever was outside my window. The coordinator, Margaret, would be angry. The project would be incomplete. I'd be abandoning my commitment, leaving work undone. But none of that mattered compared to the bone-deep certainty that staying in Nitoc another night would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. I radioed for the boat service around 9 p.m. The dispatcher sounded surprised. Weather was coming in, traveling at night was dangerous. I should wait until morning, but I insisted. Said it was a family emergency. Paid triple rate for emergency transport. Did whatever it took to ensure someone would come get me. The boat arrived around 11 p.m., running dark with only minimal lights, cutting through the black water of the Ninglik River like a knife through ink. The pilot was a Yupik man in his 50s, silent and efficient, who loaded my gear without question or commentary. We pulled away from the dock, and I watched Nitoc shrink into the distance, the scattered lights of the village getting smaller, the dark mass of the eroding land fading into the night. I thought I was safe. Thought I'd made it. Thought distance and water would be enough. But then the pilot spoke for the first time, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact, carrying over the engine noise with the ease of someone used to making himself heard in adverse conditions. "She followed you here." I looked at him, not understanding. "What?" He nodded towards something behind me. I turned, looked back toward where we come from, expecting to see the shrinking lights of Nitoc. Instead, standing on the back deck of the boat, 10 feet away from where I sat, was the figure from the photographs. She was clearer now. Horrifyingly clearer. A woman, or something that had been a woman, wearing clothes that looked decades old, sodden with river water, her face a ruin of erosion and decomposition, features half washed away like the land itself. Her eyes were holes, but they were looking at me. Her mouth was open, packed with silt and mud, but it was moving, forming words I couldn't hear over the engine. I screamed. Tried to scramble away. But there was nowhere to go on the small boat, and the pilot didn't react, didn't turn around, just kept guiding us downriver like he couldn't see what I was seeing, like this was normal, like passengers regularly shared their journey with drowned things that shouldn't exist. She moved closer. Each step left dark water pooling on the deck. Her hand reached out, fingers extended, and I could see that her flesh was the same consistency as the riverbank, the same mixture of permafrost and mud, the same slow dissolution that was claiming the village itself. When her fingers touched my face, they were cold in a way that transcended temperature. It was the cold of erosion, of displacement, of watching everything you are slowly washing away while the world documents your disappearance and does nothing to stop it. And in that touch, I understood. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to share. She'd been alone so long, watching the land that held her memory disappear piece by piece, watching the village that had defined her existence prepare to relocate and leave her behind. She'd been erased gradually, systematically, worn away by water and time and the changing climate, and no one had mourned. No one had marked her passage. No one had said, "We see you, we remember, we acknowledge what is being lost." Until I took those photographs. Until I documented the eroding edge. Until I stood in the darkness and made permanent what was temporary, created memory of what was being forgotten. I'd given her exactly what Agnes had warned about: attention. Permanent record. Proof of existence. And she'd understood that I knew what it felt like to be displaced, to have your ground wash away beneath you, to watch the landscape of your life erode until you weren't sure what was left of the foundation. The boat pilot's voice cut through my paralysis. She doesn't want to be forgotten. None of them do. The photographs, they're not just pictures. They're invitations. Ways of saying I see you. And when you say that to something that's been invisible too long, sometimes it doesn't know how to let go. Her fingers were still on my face. Her ruined eyes were still fixed on mine. And I realized with absolute clarity that this was the cost of documentation, the price of making memory permanent. You don't get to observe without being observed. You don't get to record without being recorded. You don't get to witness without being witnessed. When we reached Bethel 2 hours later, she was still there. Standing just outside my peripheral vision, present in the way that trauma is present, the way loneliness is present, the way everything you've tried to photograph and contain and understand remains with you long after the shutter clicks. The pilot helped me unload my gear onto the dock. As I stood there in the fluorescent light of the harbor, surrounded by other people and normal civilization and the comfortable illusion of safety, he said one more thing. Next Valentine's Day, when you're alone again, and you will be alone again, that's what she recognized in you, she'll be closer. She attaches to loneliness like mold to dampness. Every year, she'll be closer, until eventually you won't be able to see where you end and she begins. That's what happens when the erased and the displaced find each other. They merge. They become the same kind of absence. He walked away before I could respond. I flew back to Seattle the next day. Sent my files to the organization, minus the photographs from that night. Told them I'd completed the assignment. Moved on. But he was right. She's still here. I see her in reflections. In the corner of frames while I'm photographing anything that's being lost or demolished or displaced. In my apartment window at night, standing where my ex-boyfriend used to stand, occupying the same space of absence. And every Valentine's Day, she's closer. This year, she was standing beside my bed when I woke up. Next year, I think she'll be inside the bed. And the year after that, well, the year after that I don't think there'll be enough of me left to notice the difference between her presence and mine. Will be the same kind of erosion. The same kind of disappearance. The same kind of thing that gets documented but never saved, observed but never helped, recorded but never remembered in any way that matters. The photographs are still on my hard drive. I've never deleted them. Can't delete them, really. They're permanent now. Memory made solid. Proof that I was there, that she was there, that we both existed in that moment of recognition. And in Alaska, in Newtok, the land continues to erode. The village continues to disappear. And standing at the eastern edge, watching the river claim another few feet of permafrost, there are always figures in the shadows. Always watching. Always waiting for the next person who's alone enough, displaced enough, longing enough to document what's being lost. Always ready to follow them home.